Thank you. Thank you. Frank will be right back. I'm just here for a sec to tell you about the love of Czechs and Slovaks, and that's beautiful. That's a beautiful, yeah. And to be compared by their love for Germans, between their love of Slovaks and Germans, the Czechs are special. But as far as we're concerned, I'm starting with the Americans. You remember last time we were talking about the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and that was, of course, one issue for the new Soviet state to deal with. But in addition to dealing with the Germans, the Soviets, who, of course, decided to just give up their Western lands to the Germans, because according to Marxist theory, the Germans and all of these various capitalist powers were doomed. It was just a matter of time, as they used to say in the old song, some of us will remember. And so in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, most of the land that was Western was gone, and the Germans could savor that for a few months. But it didn't last, because there's a certain thing called the Western Front, and of course the Germans were going to lose there. So we can win in the East and lose in the West, and that will be the end of the war. But what I thought was particularly interesting was Woodrow Wilson's decision to send troops into this area of Russia. I don't have a map currently. I will shortly. But it was amusing to me to see these American troops marching through Vladivostok on the other end of Russia, really closer to Japan, way over there. And of course, what they were doing there is a matter of speculation, because it was never made clear. But one thing I can tell you, the Soviet government never forgot this, and they did not appreciate it. We did not have diplomatic relations with them until 1933. So it took a while for feelings we just sort of said, we know you're there, but we don't recognize it. It's a way of more or less protesting what they consider to be an intervention. Now, it wasn't just Americans. Japanese were getting in on it. That is to say, getting into Russia and so forth. But the idea is that Lenin's government was mighty lucky to survive. When you think about all the anti-Bolshevik Russians, on the one hand, white Russians, they were called, as opposed to the Reds. And then you got Americans, Japanese, and others who were probably part of this. So this is playing out in 1918, along with the Spanish flu epidemic and the end of the Great War, right? So it's a very, very strange period to be followed by an even stranger one in 1919. But I just wanted to share that with you. Now, among the losses, and I will certainly let Frank tell you more about this, will be what was Germany's empire. And you'll say, oh, shoot, I'm interested in the British Empire and I'm interested in the French. Well, good for you. But the Germans had a little bit, you know, we came kind of late. We weren't out there until 1871. So we can expect us to have India or something. And, you know, Bismarck was really not empty. He said it'll cost more than it's worth. But poor old Bismarck, he just couldn't resist all the lobbyists. Because, you know, everybody's going, go big eye, we want an empire. Yeah, we'll take whatever's left. And it's like, they got it, whatever's left, I mean. It's like a rummage sale or, you know, those things around the morning. You see them along the streets. So, yeah, they got what was left. And Frank, you is going to tell us all about it.
I'm going to try. Well, hey, I'm back already, okay? Just so you know. I won't even talk about the Czech Legion in Russia, just so you know. I won't go down that road. But anyway, so as the boss has said, the Germans are a little late on this deal. Bismarck wasn't really very fired up about it until 1884. And quite honestly, according to Kaiser Wilhelm, all the really good, tasty bits were gone, and they got what was left, of his point. So when we look at this map, we see that indeed they have colonies a lot of places. And I'd like to start really briefly with a thing called the Scramble for Africa. So the Scramble for Africa starts out, and there's a conference actually in Germany, and with all the big powers, and they get together and they decide they're going to carve up Africa. And a lot of these places are already kind of under their, you know, French and British control. But by the time they do carve up Africa, amazingly enough, 90% of Africa is controlled by European powers. Now, really, if you think about Germany, what kind of self-respecting empire doesn't have two things, colonies and a big navy? And indeed, if you have colonies, you need a big navy. So the Germans begin to get more colonies after they get this little piece of Africa. They begin to go at that same time, about 1885, 86, they take parts of New Guinea. And they've got that. They've got parts of China that they will get in 1898. And the way they do that is they go into China. There's a murder of 2 German missionaries, and they use gunboat diplomacy, and they go into China, and they take the city of Tsingtao, and they also take some other nice little places on the Shandong Peninsula. So they grab that. Then in 1899, they grab some stuff that they buy from Spain, because Spain just lost the war with us, and they get the Marshall Islands, the Mariana Islands, part of Samoa. So by this time, believe it or not, even though the British Empire is much larger, the French Empire is much larger, the Germans have the 3rd largest empire in the world, Deutschland über alles. So indeed, they've got something to work with. But another key part of this is that navy. And you got to have coal, because at this time ships burn coal. So they need to have places to stop and get coal. So we see that they've really gotten quite a bit of, you know, not South Africa. There's no diamond mines, but they've done a pretty good job. Well, the colonies get a little bit out of control, and there's some very bad stuff that goes on. And there's revolts, and it becomes a problem. And the Germans have come to a realization that what they're going to do is by 1905, they're going to change their colonial policy. And it's actually going to be quite, for the times, pretty liberal. They are going to build schools, and they are going to build hospitals for the indigenous people, and they're going to treat them significantly better. And this starts again about 1905. And this is going to have a big piece of when World War I starts. I think this is going to change the attitude of some of the African peoples, particularly in Tanzania. And we'll see this So World War I starts. And immediately the Japanese take Tsingtao. They don't give it back till 1922. The boss will tell you about that in the future. They lose New Guinea and all the islands in the Pacific almost immediately to the Japanese and the Australians. On the west coast of Africa, those two colonies fall almost immediately. But Tanzania, something goes on different there. And what goes on in Tanzania is there's a gentleman by the name of Paul von Littau Vorbeck. And he treats his troops that are mostly a good portion of them at the beginning, about 50-50, but as it goes on, more and more Africans join his forces in Tanzania. And he has perhaps, if not the best, one of the best guerrilla operations in the history. With this little group of Africans and Germans, they hold off thousands of British troops for the entire length of the war. They cause a tremendous amount of havoc. There's a German cruiser that sails into Tanzania, and the cruiser holds up some British forces. When that cruiser is sunk, they take the guns off of it and the sailors, and they join up with them too. And so he's in 1917, they go so far as the Germans, in order to resupply him all the way in Africa, they try to send a Zeppelin all the way there, and it becomes the longest intercontinental flight in history at that time. It doesn't make it, but indeed, they make that attempt. So this guy, for years, holds up, I've heard estimates as high as 300,000 British troops trying to hunt him down in Africa. So it's an amazing story of how he treated these people well and really made this successful. Well, unfortunately, at the end of the war, 3 days after the armistice, he finally surrenders. And we see that Germany is going to, in fact, lose all these colonies. They are going to become, not Poland, of course, but the African and the Asian colonies are going to be known as what's called mandates. And these mandates, the people that are in charge of the individual mandates are supposed to hold them in a sacred trust. Well, I'm not so sure they treat that so sacred. So you'll hear more about this in the future from my beloved doctor. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just mention, to add to what Frank said, that the so-called Black Kaiser, because he was commanding Black troops as a German, was quite celebrated in the years that we are talking about. But I gather since World War II, they put all that away and shut it down. Although he certainly had nothing to do with the Nazis. I think his son may have been a fighter in the Third Reich. That's correct. But I'm just making the point that he was not involved with them. And despite that, though, according to my source, he's no longer honored, but I guess no one from that era much is. So that's the end of the German Empire, but believe you me, these fellas didn't know about that. This gang, oh, and it's nice to have a group photo, yeah, wherever you're going on a nice road trip. So these are like the gang going, I think, rather unhappily, from Berlin to the Versailles area. And of course, you're not going for a fun trip. I mean, like we would go to Paris and sightseeing and that kind of thing. I mean, you get to stay in a hotel. I mean, you don't have to stay at the Y, but still, They put you in there and say, now we're going to have something for you. It's called a treaty. So you can say yeah or nein. And those are your choices. It's not like you might put on a mean multiple choice test. Some of it is correct, some of it's not. I mean, it's all or nothing. Because, you know, we've got a blockade, so we can make it worse. And we'll do it. But of course, the Germans are going to say, but we love President Wilson. Those 14 points are so special. We hug him in our hearts every day. Well, yeah, see if that works for you, because Wilson has to deal with those British and French, especially the latter. And they are not listening to any 14 points. I mean, for him, they will humor Woodrow Wilson. But that didn't going to cut any ice as far as dealing with Germans. So they go there, they are presented with the treaty, and they would offer some possible alterations. And I imagine the French and Germans, not to mention the Belgians, were saying, no, I don't think we need any big changes here. I think everything looks really good. And so you need to sign it or leave. So these people signed it. They took the train back to Germany, and politically speaking, they were never heard from again. I mean, we're talking about the end of careers. This is not something you could say in future German politics. I got to go to Paris and I helped sign the treaty. It's not something that's going to make you popular. I can assure you of that. I cannot tell you the different ways the Germans made the, especially French, furious. For example, the leading delegate from the Germans didn't stand up, and they kept sitting there and just taking all kinds of exception to French behavior. Whatever the case, if the Germans meant it or not, as an insult, the French and others were certainly willing to take it that way. And who knows, as far as the British were concerned, they may well have thought during this whole thing, you know, we probably went a little too far with this, because the rift, the Anglo-French rift, really gets started soon. Too late to back out. So here is what we've got. We've got what is called the Weimar Republic, so-called because in that lovely place of Weimar, where I'm sure many of you have been, they agreed to a constitution for their republic. And these delegates, who did not represent the German Empire, but represented this republic, thought they were going to get, as students would say nowadays, brownie points. And of course, they would learn very quickly, it cut no ice. You're Germans, you're horrible, and now you're going to pay for it. So suck it up. This, of course, was part of the reparations, which will cause problems for years and years to come. That is to say, the assessment of all the damages for which Germans were responsible in the West. In the cases, particularly of Belgium and France. The causes of this are many and not really our issue. But notice that even worse for the Germans than the money was being forced to sign an agreement that included Article 231, which in essence set the basis for reparations. The so-called, but it didn't say this, but the so-called war guilt clause. That is, we caused the war. The idea of Article 231, the war guilt, was as a legal basis to you caused the war, so now you pay for it. The Germans didn't agree with that because the Germans felt, according to what I've read, that it was caused by a variety of factors. But now they were told either agree to it or else. What else could have been done? Well, that's been debated too. In any event, it's something that the Germans will carry around with them and become a very, very difficult matter in terms of relationships. And of course, politicians who have accepted this by signing the agreement, that's why you never hear from them again, because if they had any hope of continuing a career in the Republic, obviously this isn't going to go down with the voters. So, yeah, they were finished. Now, welcome to the neighborhood. Yes, Poland and Czechoslovakia. Well, all of us would be happy to have a neighbor like Frank, but we can't necessarily assume that every Czech was of that level, right? I mean, Frank is really special, but yeah. But and I'm sure many Czechs were quite nice.
Some not so much.
And lovely Slovaks too. Let's say something nice about them. He's shaking his head in dispute. Apparently the ecumenical aspect has not worked out between Czechs and Slovaks, but whatever the case, you can see the German Republic, the Weimar Republic, has definitely done some shrinking since the days of Bismarck. Bismarck would be really sad. And you can see Czechoslovakia, as one person puts it, jutting into Germany in a way that is not happy among Germans. But it's to be noted, in all fairness, that the lands that we see were never part of Germany. They were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But when we see Poland, we have a very strange situation. Very strange indeed. Poland's been created. Remember those 14 points. Who could forget them? So when they're working on this geography, remember all those folks we saw last time that Wilson brought with him? And they're all sitting around with the map and say, now, we got to fix Poland up. And don't you think there were a lot of Polish people, they lobbyists, and they were saying, we need this, we need that. And poor Wilson, I mean, I imagine he has to listen to all these folks, and then you see the way they do it. They cut this area called the Polish corridor. And then you see the red over there, the red area. They say, well, y'all can have that, you Germans. That's what's called East Prussia. So you can keep that. But you see, if you live in East Prussia, you're going to have to go through Poland to go over to Germany. And oh, Lord, that's going to create terrible problems. Because you can imagine that, oh, I don't know, the Polish police stop a German driver. And I mean, all kinds of issues because you lack the warmth. You lack the brotherhood, you know, the whole, you know, sorry, I violated your laws. But yes, it's probable to say that there's no love lost between any of these neighbors. And we always think, well, maybe not, that Poles and Czechs have a fondness for each other. Not so much. So there you are. It's a strange neighborhood, isn't it? But there's very little warmth. But don't ask the Czechs and Poles because they're happy just to have countries, right? I mean, they fought for it and they got it. And the British and the French, they feel, owed it to them. And of course, you see the big bad so-called Soviet Russia. Did you see that? It's not the Soviet Union yet. So it's sort of like we're coming. We'll be in a map near you coming soon. But we're not quite there yet. We're still in a process of development because we're only talking 1919, 1922. We're going to unveil the whole USSR in another year or so. So that is basically what they were establishing for Germany. And we're going to look at some of the other aspects of the agreement. I just put, you notice how I put sort of losers and winners. It's kind of like, I just thought, okay, so who do we start out with? Big time, Austria and Hungary. Serious loser. Remember the big empire? That's gone. Long gone. And think Sound of Music, Austria, okay? That's what we're talking about. We've got big Vienna and then lots of beautiful countryside. Salzburg's nice, but it's really a lot of country, skiing and hiking. You know, I'm not pushing Austrian trips. I'm just saying it's small, very nice, and that's just the way they intended it. And they got it. And of course, it's overwhelmingly German. And you'll love this. Apparently, the Austrians actually said, you know, President Wilson, you had said how much you believed in all people coming together and being as one. How about we Austrians being part of Weimar Germany? Well, we know what answer they're going to get. 9! Because that's what comes from being a loser. You know, it's if you're a winner, you can all, yeah, you get all this. I don't think you were on the losing team. You were on the losing team, I mean. Hungary. If you thought Austria got it bad, those Hungarians really got it. And you got all these people. It's like a bunch of vultures around Hungary. Everybody wants to know on it. And so Hungary, you can see it down there next to it. You see Romania particularly. And you think, gosh, Romania is just practically bulging. Well, I reckon so. They're getting all that Transylvania, getting all of the lands around there, because what are the Hungarians going to do about it? I mean, they'll pay off. I mean, they'll be angry, but and they'll say, but the Austrians, they did this. We didn't do it. We like y'all. Why do we have to suffer? You're a loser. And then, of course, poor Bulgaria, they pulled in. But again, that was not even a good idea for them to get in. But they lost land to Romania. I think Romania is the big gainer there, as you can see. Gainers, Czechoslovakia, yeah. Very good leaders that we're going to see. And Poland. Oh, and the emerging country that does not yet have the name, but it will soon, Yugoslavia. Some of us remember Tito and all of that era. This is a period that, with Croatia and Serbia and all those coming together, and you see it down there, and you think there's already going to be a little tension among the former allies, because there's territory, and you see it there, right there on the coast of Yugoslavia, and that will be a conflict between the Italians and the Yugoslavs. And it's sad, and again, if you can imagine Wilson and all of that team of American experts getting them among themselves and thinking, these people need to calm down and cool it and stop fighting and just be glad they got some territory and let it go. But we know that the Yugoslavs and the Romanians and so forth are among the winners, and they are certainly willing to let Hungarians and Austrians and all the rest of the people who were on the losing side pay with their lands as these others will grow. Don't get mad, get even. Yes, because as these conferences go on and eventually they will end, they are thinking about the time will soon come that we will deal with these issues. In other words, no one, I think, is willing to say, well, if that's the decision they've made, then I guess we need to, we need to accept it and be at peace. I think, no, these are going to go on. How long? Well, at least until World War II. So it's just interesting, though, to see it right at the time, because as we know, during this period, these maps do change, and they change pretty quickly. Speaking of change, look at this one. There it is, the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. Wow. How about that? This is, of course, pre-Yugoslavia. So if you ever get asked that question, if it comes up on Trivial Pursuit or anything like that, what was Yugoslavia called before it was Yugoslavia? Now you know. They come together, and I'm sure with all the love of Czechs and Slovaks, these folks love each other the same level. Would you think?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. See? Oh, Bosnia, Serbia, all of these areas. Can you imagine? Now, look in our pinstripe, Hungary, and we're talking, look at all that land, Croatia up there, and you see people. Transylvania. Yes. Can you just imagine the gnawing? Give me a piece of that, a chunk of this. This is, and believe me, they don't always ask or hold out a white flag and say, maybe we can just split it. We send in troops and then they defend and then we go from there. This is so conflicted, this whole area that you see. We can understand is going to be in a lot of turmoil for the foreseeable future. Now, for something really relevant, how about Russia and Ukraine? Or as we used to say, the Ukraine back then. This has to do with its gradual annexation during this era. It was briefly independent, having been part of the Russian Empire, and then, of course, retaken by the Soviet Union. So everybody, as you can see, is, well, everybody in the eastern central areas are taking all of these territories, and of course, Hungary is the one that's like being abused. It's bad to be on the wrong side, as I'm sure Hungarians knew. Hungary becomes what they call in history a revisionist power, meaning we need some changes. And of course, they would find friends in Germany who quite agreed with them. We want some changes too. So Hungarians and Germans are definitely not happy about this agreement. I suspect the Romanians, on the other hand, are happy as can be because they gained so much. But can they keep it? It's a strange combination. Tito seemed to make it work, but, you know, after his death in 1980, its days were numbered. In what is known in France as a sort of health zone, cordon sanitaire in French, the Allies seem to have sort of created a series of states that were, shall we say, hostile to the Soviet Union. I mean, we understand that many states are hostile to Russia today, but in that particular time, Russia becoming the Soviet Union had a philosophy that the Allies, including the French, considered a communicable disease. And that, of course, is communism. It's so basically, they looked at these groups of nations from Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and all that, all the way down, and said this is like sort of like a zone protection. And this filth of communism, Marx's greatest hits, you know, none of that. It won't go west. And if it does, it'll go to those Germans. So, but because Germans are not on the most popular list right now, so they're still, but that's sort of interesting. That's the way they viewed it. It will only be later when the French will look at this with renewed interest as possible special friendships. But now they just see it that way and think that's all we need it for, is basically that the Russians, Soviets, would not go any further that way. This is the man that I love his clothes. He knew how to dress. You don't get that at Walmart, okay? I promise. He was a serious dresser. The hero of the famous Battle of Gallipoli that some of you probably know about from military history, became an individual who was willing, as many military figures are, to become a civilian leader when the time was ripe. And if the Ottoman Empire was indeed, as the Tsar used to say, the sick man of Europe, then the Ottoman Empire's defeat in World War I meant that the Sultan's government was about out of commission. One reason I don't mention that is because the Sultan's government had already lost most of what we would call European territory, in Eastern Europe. But now they lose virtually everything outside what we call Turkey. So the Sultan is basically gone, done in. They have several treaties because the first treaty with the Sultan's government is defunct, just like the Sultan's government is defunct. So it's a complex issue, but the main thing to know is this great military figure known by the Turks as Ataturk, yes, who believed that Turkey, like Japan, must adapt externally to Western ways and internally remain true to themselves. And he was determined, despite some nasty people around him, like Greeks. And I don't think they like each other even now. That's just my sense. I always think, maybe there'll come a day we can just, behave and last. There'll be a love thing, but I haven't seen any evidence. The Greco-Turkish relationship. In any event, they're dealing with the Greeks, which, way back then, the population was all mixed, and not now, but that will require lots and lots of change to come. And then to the north, the Russians. So the Turks have lots of people who don't like them. But internally, Turkey is determined under Mustafa Kemal, whatever it takes to adapt to Western ways and to become a significant power. That with all of its empire gone. And of course, as Frank was indicating, that connects to all of these Middle Eastern lands, which will now become mandates. And we'll certainly be talking about that shortly. But I just love his tales. That white tie, he didn't mess around. Didn't know informal or casual dress. I mean, he goes all the way. But this is the one, Sir Arthur Balfour, because he is a very interesting figure to me. And this facsimile of his letter to Lord Rothschild, who was considered a sort of informal leader of British Jewish people. He had been, that is, Lord Rothschild was an individual who had the clout, the money, the influence among Jewish wealthy people to make a significant impression among British leaders, particularly those like Sir Arthur here, who were biblical, if you will, supporters of Hebrews and the cause that would be called Zionism. Believe it or not, there had been some hope on the part of, I suspect, British leaders that we really understand that Jewish people would like to have a place to call their own. But this has been a dream since Theodore Herzl in the 19th century. But the idea is you all can move to Uganda. You know, that's part of our empire. And we would love for you all to settle down in Uganda, which, I mean, I've never been to Uganda. So I'm thinking some of these Jewish leaders like Lord Rothschild, well, you know, we really appreciate that, but let's take that and maybe we can kind of bounce it around and maybe talk about some other possibilities. Starting with P and having several syllables. But the idea being, of course, that Balfour will bring about an agreement from the British cabinet of the day in 1917. And that would be Lloyd George's. And you say, gosh, what a deeply spiritual thing. Oh, I think there were certain other non-religious factors. Just guessing here, but you know, and I know that this was huge. And I'm just thinking, you know, when whoever typed that, and you remember the days of the old typewriters, and you're thinking, because you can even see where, you know, when a letter doesn't come out. But basically, the idea is, did they know how historic this was going to be? Because believe you me, it went into the mailbox of this Rothschild, and boy, it just spread quickly among the Jewish community leaders and became then major. And from Britain, of course, to other segments like the USA, because by then, of course, we were in the war. Now, for those like myself who are interested in Zionism and that, you will notice clearly he tries to say we do not want to interfere in the rights of other people in Palestine. Says, you know, Her Majesty's government, the sympathy with the Jewish Zionist aspiration. And you wonder if folks were reading the rest of it or just celebrating that first part. Because the second part is sort of that caveat, like they always say on those drug ads on television. You know, you could get this, you could get that. But that always seemed like in that second section, it's like saying, yeah, but now you can't have it all. So now you need to calm down. There in Palestine, existing non-Jewish community, which is very polite, but you know what they mean. And that is Balfour, this very, very important British figure of the day, the British foreign minister of the time. And that, of course, war measure. And of course, then I always think of Peter O'Toole as Lawrence of Arabia. Forgive me, I'm sorry. It just, I can't help it. It just comes up. Yeah. And you think about I bet you not everybody was happy about this. Not at all. And here, speaking of mandates, here we are. Because, believe it or not, they actually thought maybe they could get the United States a mandate. The question came up, how would you all like to have a mandate with Turkey? Talking to the Americans. And the Americans said, thanks anyway. We don't think so. I just don't think the United States was ready for any sort of commitment like that. But that certainly was not true of British and French. They had already pre-planned it. Some of you are familiar with the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which basically said, how would you like some Palestine? Well, you could have some Syria. Thanks, merci. How about, would you like some Mesopotamia? All of this was sort of planned because, of course, they were getting ready for the defeat of the Ottoman Empire. Mandates are a way of saying colonies aren't cool anymore. You know, it was cool. We still have them. So that's fine. But we're not going to get any more. Now we're just going to care for people. We just need Barbara Streisand to sing about it, right? Because we care about Palestinians. We care about Iraqis or Syrians. So we're just going to love on them. And we'll get to ratemymandate.com. And people can tell us what a good job we've done. And you say, well, why only the British and the French? Well, they're the only ones who are out there. Who else is going to do it? No one else has the wherewithal to manage a mandate in these particular conditions. But those are the ones in the East, the Middle East, that indicate what will happen in that former area of the Ottoman Empire, which will be so important. And there he is up there, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. There, the Turkish area, what's left of the old Ottoman Empire. And believe you me, it will be highly significant. But we all know the significance of Iraq and all the rest for the future. So, thinking about as we move forward, reparations are obvious because, of course, like many debts, it's going to be on the installment plan. And sometimes people get unhappy about, student loans, all that mess. That's always, isn't that always on the installment plan? You pay this much and you pay. I mean, I get headaches. It would make me stay up at night because I like to pay off everything. But that's just me. But that is the idea, German reparations, because it just goes on and on and on. So that is going to be a problem, and the French and the Belgians are always unhappy, always. And the Germans are unhappy, and everybody's calling on Washington and London, get more involved. Originally, before Wilson left this mess behind and went back to the United States to try to campaign for the treaty and his plans, he had agreed to what they call a guarantee to France, because Clemenceau, the French leader, felt, the Germans are always a danger to us. he had been old enough, he could remember the Franco-Prussian War. So he was like, our relationship has been strained, you Brits and you Yanks, but we're expecting you now to stand up with us. And I guess Wilson, maybe Lord George was saying, yeah, we're there for you, man. You're our buddy. One of me and all that. In fact, this guarantee was never approved by the United States. And so the British were going like, well, I guess since the United States didn't agree to it, then we don't have to either. Negative, void. Yeah, I mean, that's the way it goes. And the French are feeling like sad is one word for it. I think a stronger word would be, but I don't use that in public. But the idea is the French were not happy at all, because that whole idea of the guarantee, that they were thinking the British and the Americans would jump in there and protect France. It just didn't happen. And finally, of course, that red disease. Yes, menace. Menace is a good word for it, because we've got to keep sheriff there spraying and keeping them away, because they're everywhere. Communists. And can you think of a bigger red year than 1920, right around in there? Some of you know about A. Mitchell Palmer and the communist raids, fear of anarchy in this country. So all of this because of the fear, for example, of communists in Germany, a takeover. That was always Karl Marx's dream. And many of the Russians said, we're not really that advanced. So what we need is a communist upheaval in Germany. Boy, that would be great. That would be cool. And I mean, there was a brief one in Bavaria and something of one in Hungary. But ultimately, it's up to Mother Russia to carry on the great cause. But communism remained a great fear, and that, of course, will continue forward. Let us look now at some of those factors. First of all, the United States, after Woodrow Wilson, just essentially refuses to make any further commitments to Europe. I don't know if this is fully because of Wilson, but it's certainly true that the idea of the Wilsonian internationalism was no longer in style. And that could have been by the time that he was ill, even before he was out of office. But the United States, I think the voters at least felt that we had done enough, and they had to deal with their own problems and not expect any commitments from the United States. I call it difficulty. You could call it that. I mean, let's face it, those of you who've been with me in courses in the Middle Ages and English history know that relationship is filled with pain and heartache. If you say they love each other, I don't know where you found that. I'm happy for you that you found that. It's always good to find people who could love each other. But I'm thinking the British feel, okay, we've done all of this. It's time for you French to manage yourself. Don't depend on us. We'd rather go our own way. Some have said that maybe the British had really felt they'd gone too far. And now they were saying, you know, we have a lot of friends over there in Germany. And now that the war is over, we would like to explore that relationship. I mean, it's really, really strange if you don't accept that there's probably the British have more in common with the Germans than they do with the French. So the fact they just happen to be on the same side in World War I, that's quickly no longer a major factor, and they just want the French to get on about their way. And of course, difficulties, resentments with Weimar Germany, no surprise. The Soviet Union fascinates me because it's a new kind of state. Like when we talk about diplomatic history, for many of them, it's a matter of, do they even have diplomacy? Because we're a revolutionary state. We don't do those things. We don't put on those fancy clothes. And as such, we're comrades. We're seeking, we're all about working people, you know, that all of that. And so they're really going to be very, very different. And there will be reds everywhere. And they're all like sympathetic to the Soviet Union. So we have to be very suspicious and spies. Trouble, trouble, trouble. Can the Soviet Union be saved? You know, sort of like the marriage column in the old magazines. It's like it will be very, very hard diplomatically speaking, because I've seen pictures, you know, Soviet delegates coming to Washington and shaking their hands, and I'm thinking, ugh, you know, yuck, communist hands, you lousy red, you know. And then how you like that relationship issue? Sounds like Oprah. They were having Turkey and Greece. That is not good. So yeah, they needed somebody to have them come on a show and talk out their issues, but it hadn't worked so far. Italy and Yugoslavia. Yeah, again, you can't ever say they could ever solve their issues. And poor Hungary feels like everybody's picking on them. I mean, think about the Romanians. If you were Hungarians and Romanians, they think there's no love there. Because think about that Transylvania, don't you think they want to get that back? The Hungarians have plans. And they're just not large enough to carry them off yet. But when they develop a new relationship with the Germans, that's going to be possible. Yeah. So, what do you know? Another map. Now look at our pretty pinstripe, starting with the west, and then we'll go east. Yes, it's Ireland. There is the area. I don't know whether this is basically saying that the whole area that the IRA was active in is there, because there was a time that we will see that there was a dominion of Ireland. There was the Irish were reluctantly forced into the British Empire, so to speak, and that will be ended in a few years. But right now, there is agitation throughout. So that will be a problem. If the British were thinking about, oh, we're just worried about people in France, we're so worried, I think they got enough problems at home, as we will see. And we see, of course, all of the other areas. There's Belgium, and you see the Rhine, you see all that occupied land there between France and Belgium and Germany, all having to do with reparations and payments. And you see that area over there in Yugoslavia or near Yugoslavia. And that area, of course, is bitterly contested between Yugoslavia and Italy. And of course, Czech friends are right there, along with their Slovak buddies. Yes, and they are there, and Hungarians and Austrians and Germans and Poles even are, shall we say, concerned about those territories. There's so many issues, in other words, that are waiting to be contested and dealt with, even though, of course, Woodrow Wilson, now a victim of stroke, with the White House, presumably that is controlled by the First Lady, is, yeah, I mean, it's a very, very strange situation in 1920. If you read books on it, she was a very interesting person, the second Mrs. Wilson. I couldn't resist. I apologize. I mean, but this is a fashion parade. Okay. Notice those buttons. Look at that blazer. Again, not even Joseph Bank would have the quality that he would wear. So he would shop at the best. And again, Ataturk would establish this new Turkey. And it was a Turkey. You remember that the women were now showing their bottom legs through dresses and not wearing scarves. And the men were having to shave. And all of this creating dissension, but I don't think Ataturk said, well, if you all don't want to do it, then it's okay. I don't think he had that kind of regime. I think it was a question of, I'm doing it and so will you. And so there is just a new Turkey, a Turkey essentially of Turks. And if you happen to be a non-Turk, maybe you would like to move. But that doesn't happen overnight, does it? Here they are, the big two. Pilsudski, who will lead the new Poland, because you can always think about Wilson had responded to his Polish American constituency. And he could point, I mean, Pilsudski had worked hard for this to get that Poland. And this was very, very important from a political stance. And remember those 14 points? Poland was right in there. There will be a Poland. And I mean, a lot of folks in Chicago too.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah. So there are plenty of Polish folks. And so there was a lot of pressure on Woodrow Wilson, no doubt about it. And just in case anybody forgot, how about we pull out famous pianist Paderewski? He was on tour, everybody's favorite Pole. So it's like, oh yeah. And he would do concerts. I remember my mother telling me about that as a girl. She went to a Paderewski concert because, of course, all the money, goes to the Poland Fund. I mean, they were a country by this point, but he was still doing tours. He didn't live there, but he went there and waved to everybody and then go to London or these other places and say, here's the Polish Charity Appeal, or, you know, all of that. He was the biggest name, as far as I'm aware, for the Polish cause. So you see them there. And I think he was anxious to get back. He was from either Santa Barbara or somewhere else nice in California. So I'm sure, because I think it gets right cold in Poland.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think he wanted to be in Southern California. Yeah, so don't be fooled by that fur coat. I think he was get back on his togs, and maybe not any windsurfing, but yeah, basically ready to get there. But that was symbolic. Now, Pilsudski was there, and he was serious. And when you are Poland and you're between the Soviet Union and Germany, we've got issues. We've got questions. We've got problems. Might keep us up. Yes. So Pilsudski was definitely someone who had a lot to think about in the future. In fact, there were so many issues. And again, I know we all think about Ukraine, and there is Belarus to the north, or what we used to say is Belorussia. And these are various parts that the Poles, even in 1920, 21, and so forth, were already contesting with the Soviets. So look at the areas. And I think it's kind of interesting when you look at the area of Ukraine, you see Kiev, or as I used to, Kiev, whichever. All of this is interesting to think. The Poles always seem to be anxious to expand. And it's like, I guess, the SEC pushing back, way back. I mean, it's like, and they go forward, and then they push it back, and they go forward. It's more or less a constant. And you think, boy, somebody should have given them a signal for peace or something, because this went on rather constantly during the early 20s. And that doesn't resolve the issue. I guess they just ran out of steam. I mean, I've never understood how the Russians are like constantly at war throughout this period. It's like they defeat the Reds, defeat the Whites in their long war. And then, of course, the minute Poland gets organized, they get a military force and they say, let's go get them. And so they're going to war with the Soviets because they want to get some of the goodies over here in what I suppose you could say were the western part of Ukraine. And see Minsk up there, the Belarus and all of that area. So this territory is going to be hotly contested. And as a result, and I find this very interesting, the French are going to be waiting in the wings and saying to the Poles, you're having some troubles and we would love to have a friend. Could we get together and have a relationship? And apparently that's exactly what happens. It will be an alliance, basically a sort of like, if you get attacked, we'll be there for you. If we're attacked, you'll be there for us. And it lasts until 1939, and we are aware that why it's that particular year, because that's the end of Poland. To say the Polish-Soviet relationship was difficult is one way to put it, but maybe difficult is not a strong enough word, but very difficult. But anyway, there is a Franco-Polish relationship, and the Poles are going like, we're so new, and yet we already have this big friend. I mean, Warsaw, Paris. Hey, this is kind of great. We'll see how that works for them later on, but that is the way it will be. And meanwhile, as we've seen, the Yugoslav situation and the conflict between Yugoslavia and Italy and Hungary and all the rest of it is almost never ending. And that will go on. And of course, powers like the Soviet Union and others will get dragged into it because of their size. I just say significance, but how can we just say capital S? Because there is Czechoslovakia.
Notice the red circle.
I did. I wonder who did that. Okay. Jacques. Okay. I think I know. But yes, just in case we missed it, I think we see it there and you say, wow, it's so beautiful. It's so wonderful. Yeah, seriously, Prague. And I bet the food's good too.
Good.
Yeah, there you go. So the idea being that it is right there in Central Europe, and we see the land around it. And of course, this is the famous Sudetenland, full of people of German ethnicity. And of course, if you're doing preview of problems to come, I think that will do nicely. Now, Frank may have alluded to, but I will say it definitely. There's not always love between Czechs and Slovaks. Okay, I can just say that.
That's true.
Without fear of contradiction. We understand that even in the most loving of relationships,
There could be problems.
yes, thank you. And there was definitely one there. So, I mean, there are many issues that we will see unfold as we go. But some called it the Switzerland of Central Europe. And doesn't that sound wonderful? I don't know if it's true, but it sounded wonderful. Because when we think of Switzerland, we think of all these different ethnicities coming together in groups and speaking different languages. I'll say yes, it's got lots of beautiful areas like Switzerland and so forth, but also the variety of people can often create issues because some may really not want to be there. As in Sudetenlanders who were of the German persuasion, Hungarians and others who say, I know it's hard for us to imagine, but some are saying, we really don't want to be under Czechs.
Hard to believe.
I know. I mean, most of us would just, cheer. But let's face it, it was in many ways the only democracy that would survive during this whole period. And much, of course, is due to the man named Benesh, the leader, who will be so famous even up to the Cold War. The founder, his mentor, as we say nowadays, was Masaryk, and he's the man with the goatee. And much younger, quite a bit younger, several decades. They would be there as major figures. And because of what I think is fair to say, the precarious position of Czechoslovakia, Benesh would spend a lot of his time trying to get allies and friends to support him. When you're a small country, in the midst of people with all these problems, and you're trying to maintain it. And he did so until 1938, 1939, and he decided to retire for a while, meaning World War II. And then he will return for another round, although the Cold War would certainly create problems for him, given Czechoslovakia's situation. Italy, the Italians felt betrayed. You know, you promised us so much and you gave so little. And I'm sure the British and the French, not to mention the Americans, felt like, I think you folks need to quit your quibbling. You were lucky you got anything. So you didn't do that much. And so I always believed that the Italians would have been better advised to stay out of the war altogether, but they were never satisfied with the results. And so during the Versailles Peace Conference, they were there sometimes and other times they were not. And they were generally not, shall we say, a positive forward in the negotiations, because essentially it's somebody saying, how do you feel about the 14 points? Are you excited about the legal? I mean, they say, how about our land over there in Eastern Europe? We want it now. We gave up so much because we did lose those battles. That was unfortunate, but yeah, it was just a bad situation. So the Italians were not at all happy about being an ally, and the future of Italy, of course, as we all know, Benito Mussolini is coming to a capital near you, 1922, because, and think how fast that is after World War I, because the fear of communism and the enormous discontent after the peace settlement. So the Italian situation is not pretty. Is there an area that we would like to bring up? One point I wanted to make about Bismarck in Africa, I have read, and I think you would agree, Frank, you know, many Germans thought the whole thing was a waste of time and resources.
Okay, you didn't think it was a good idea.
So, but it went on because, what do we call it? Lobbying. There are always groups out there, but after all that, it's all gone. Seemed like a good idea at the time, but that was over. And you know, I think that's so minor when you go from World War I to World War II. It's not like that's all part of some sort of Third Reich dream. I've never seen much evidence for that.
There was some talk in 1943.
Oh yeah, I know. And there was also thought of the Arab leaders talking to Hitler about some help against Jews. But I just mean that was pretty ephemeral. But anyway, thank you all, and I'll see you next time. We'll go on. Yeah.